I'm trying to survive this period of incompetence and ignorance that has been brought on by Project 2025 by our president, who is not paying much attention. It's just working its way through all of the people he has appointed. These seem to be mostly people who are TV friendly, but not necessarily paragons of intellectual behavior. So I go to one of my favorite authors, Alberto Hirschman. This is called the Rhetoric of Reaction. Rhetoric meaning obviously the ideas that one uses to argue with, and reaction meaning reaction to the general trend of things. In this book, the prologue essentially talks about three historic movements, politically speaking, in the last since the 18th century. This is a typology that was created by T.H. Marshall, and Hirschman uses it as a kind of a historic shaping of his book. He talks about first the march of progress with civil citizenship. Obviously, not much of a march from the American Revolution, but the French Revolution was about getting rid of the monarchy, getting rid of the aristocracy, and in general, getting rid of religion. These were seen by the French reformers as the obstacles to change, and of course that's what they did. So the first movement in history out of this 18th century was the movement of civil citizenship, the shaping of it as all of us, as opposed to the king and the aristocracy and the church and the trying to reduce the influence of class and economic status. The second change was the change to universal voting, which started in the 19th century and was, in the United States in the 1921, women were given the right to vote. And so we have universal voting. The third is the development of the welfare state. In other words, the taking care of those people who can't take care of themselves. And in our diverse society, with some of the supports, the past supports, religious and otherwise, that took care of people who were in disadvantaged situations. The state would step in. Now, there have been negative arguments against all of these three things: civil citizenship, the universal voting, and the welfare state. It's all going on. The what Hirschman proposes is that there are actually three arguments, three classes of arguments, theses, if you will, that are used against progress, against the movement. I think there's a fourth category that he didn't include in his, and that's the one we're going through right now, which is that of individual rights. The right to be transgender, for instance, being sort of the identifiable one, that but LGBTQ plus people also having their rights. Anyway, the three are perversity, a perverse argument, and the argument basically is that anything we try is going to have perverse effects and maybe even reverse itself completely. The second is futility, and the third is jeopardy. Now, the sort of the father of all rhetoric of reaction is Edmund Burke, who was writing in the 1790s about the French Revolution. It was largely right. He was writing about how if you get rid of religion and you get rid of the monarchy and you get rid of aristocracy, that it's going to descend into tyranny, which it did. I mean, the entire 19th century was kind of a reaction to the French Revolution. It was especially large here in the United States, where the Second Great Awakening, religious awakening, happened. Started by the Wesleys earlier, but it was a reaction to the French Revolution, which was, in their minds, pretty ick. So, what perversity does, it was really first sort of formulated by Burke, but Burke was working on principles that he'd gotten from the Scottish Enlightenment, particularly from Adam Smith and others. And Adam Smith was also pretty much a secularizer, as the French Revolution was, about taking things away from religious life and moving it into what he called the invisible hand. But there was a kind of reactiveness. Burke has been honored for a long time because he did, in the midst of the starting part of the French Revolution, he was writing about how it would descend into tyranny, which it did, and eventually ended up in Bonaparte, and then, of course, later on, the religion and monarchy and aristocracy all came back. Now, it would take the First World War to destroy aristocracy completely, and although we still have aristocrats, but they're generated by their own creativeness. They're not aristocrats born to it. Well, perversity is an argument that's brought up all the time. Oh yes, you want to have minimum wage, but tut, it's going to have perverse effects. But the thing is that there can be some perverse effects, but the overall good of it is much better than the little perversity that comes from it. But there aren't any real strong arguments for reacting to that, except certainly not economically. Most people or many of the conservative, Hirschman's an economist, and so he has economic arguments in there. But he says one thing that we don't do when we look at the minimum wage is what it does to the labor market. And actually what it does to the labor market is really positive in general, perhaps some limited perverse effects. But that's pretty much what he notices with all of the arguments, that there are perverse effects, but they are sort of the sprinkles on the ice cream. They're not really mostly the things that progress allows turn out to be good things. And of course there are consequences, unintended, other consequences besides perverse effects, many of them quite good. But the argument, often reaction argument against progress, is one that often isn't hit directly. In other words, the general state of things has been in the face of progressive arguments. Now, that's the interesting thing about the most notable thing that's happened right now, is that the general assumption that progress is good has been stalled. It sort of started with Ronald Reagan and has just developed its way to the narcissistic fraud that Mr. Trump is. Now, Mr. Trump is not an intellect in any sense of the word. He's actually a reality television personality, which he's very good at, and he has a way of keeping himself in the news. But that being the case, the changes that are going on, which are, from my point of view, largely reprehensible, that they will have unintended consequences too, some of which are perverse and will mean that the policies that are, and they are policies. The Project 2025 is really a policy to reverse things back to the 1930s. People in the 1930s who were against Franklin Roosevelt, they sort of descended into, they sort of disappeared from society, and since that time, the ascendancy of what government can do for us has become more and more important. Now, Trump and company are trying to reverse that, and to a certain extent they will. But I think it'll be less than they anticipate. Coming on with my own perverse, the intended consequences is we can't really go back to that time, and they're going back to it in a particular way, which is to give the executive, Mr. Trump in this case, a almost king-like quality to his governance. The Supreme Court is pretty much letting him do whatever he wants, and which, by the way, is quite different than what happened to Franklin Roosevelt. remember that Hoover, the previous president, was pretty much a laissez-faire capitalist and could not think of anything to do to help the populace, that he wasn't going to do anything because of the idea of perverse consequences, or whatever idea was in his head, who knows. But he just didn't do anything. And in the process, they passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which basically isolated all of the economies, and possibly generated the trajectory of Japanese society to eventually fairly quickly go into Manchuria, but then after Manchuria eventually attack us at Pearl Harbor. That was at least one of the effects of the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Hard to nail that down exactly, but we did such a poor job of dealing with the Great Depression, and we dealt with it as a country through what was going on with FDR, but FDR had trouble getting his agenda through, and he threatened to pack the Supreme Court with other people. A switch in time paid save 9 comes from that period when there were 9 justices, and he was going to pack the court in order to get his legislation by, and lo and behold, they started passing on his legislation in the Supreme Court. Now, Trump doesn't have that problem. He has managed to get a favorable court for his actions. And so we're going to have to put up with them for a while. But I don't think, they will have unintended consequences, some of which will not be what they think it's going to be. But they can't take us back to the 1930s. I just don't think. I recommend this book highly. Anything that Hirschman wrote is well worth reading. He's the kind of economist that writes for lay people, so it's not a lot of figures and stuff. It's interesting. Anyway, have a good day.